Hello friends, I am Rob, the Dungeon Tutor, and welcome to a new series that I'm doing called Masterclass. This series is designed with the Game Master in mind, and it's a look behind the scenes to try to help people to prepare and run pre-made adventures from the earliest days of gaming on up to modernity. These pre-designed adventures are there to give game masters a little bit of a hand up. Rather than having to create everything from whole cloth, they allow a game master to take a writer's work and turn it into the adventure that they will shock and impress their characters and the players that are running them whenever they step up to the gaming table. Now, there are any number of resources out there to make your own materials, and certainly I'm willing to do that, so feel free to reach out if you're interested in help with actually making your own games. But sometimes these games can be a little bit difficult to run as well. There's certain elements that are in place that certainly can be a challenge if you aren't prepared. So that's what I'm here for. The very first subject that we're going to cover in Masterclass is Gooey Cube's The Darkest Dream, the first part of the Red Star Rising campaign, and certainly elements of this video are going to be useful throughout the Gooey Cube experiences and possibly other adventures as you go along. So, what are the challenges for running this game? Well, first of all, look at it. It's a thick box, and the entirety is filled with adventure. Most of this is designed to make things easy on you as a game master, but they can end up complicating things by giving you almost too much to deal with. So if you're not prepared, this is not an adventure that a person probably should just grab, open up, and start running for their players. It begs for a bit more care and attention, which we will be highlighting in this video. So, upon opening the adventure, you see that, yeah, there isn't a lot of open space in here. There's a lot of moving parts to make the resources the Game Master is going to need easy to access and there when you need it. It also has a lot of pre-generated characters available so that your players don't have to work very hard at making up characters and the like. And all kinds of extra little tricks and trinkets to allow your game to really take flight. But here's the thing. A first-time game master opening this up is possibly going to be really intimidated by all the things that are in here. So to that, I would say take a deep breath, and we're going to get you through this, okay? Good. Now, the very first thing that you would see upon opening it up is a letter. It is from Goo, the founder of Gooey Cube, and it is a greeting, because he's a social guy, and also some warnings about how this is going to be a different experience for you than any other game that you may have run. This is true. This game is unlike any other campaign that you might have played, for better or for worse. So, it does behoove you to prepare for it a little bit differently. This letter explains some of the ways in which you should treat this differently than a standard adventure. And if you're brand new to game mastering, don't fear. It may sound dire, but it's actually not that bad. And my hope is with this video, it's going to be even easier. So, with Alphinius's warning out of the way, there are a couple of things that you should note. First of all, you'll note that your pack comes with a set of character portraits. It's going to be on the top. Very useful, but at this point, don't even bother looking at them. Just set them aside or admire them as you will, but they will become very important as your story unfolds. There will be a deck of cards for your special items, as well as GUI reward cards. As a game master, I recommend getting some penny sleeves and putting them in place to secure them so they don't get roughed up through the course of your using them. You can use these again and again and again and again, and therefore you kind of want to keep them in good shape. Also be careful if you're going to be giving these resources out to your players to make sure that they're responsible folk who aren't going to lose them on you. So, just a few initial notes. Nothing too serious though, especially if the game is all going to be kept in one place. can be pretty useful. Now, another couple of things that you're going to see. You're going to have 2 books. They're both spiral bound, which I'll explain that benefit to you in a moment. But you will have... Did I tell you it's really packed? It is. You will have the GM reference book, which is a little bit thicker. And you will have the Chapter 1 of the Red Star Rising campaign storybook. 2 of them together. Each one is thick as a standard adventure, actually thicker, with full color art and all kinds of neat stuff. But a few things that you'll notice in here. No maps. And in the storybook, you aren't going to have the monster statistics and things. These are companion pieces that are meant to work side by side. And at the moment, you can set those aside. We'll be covering those next. But first, we're going to finish unpacking. You will then also find, despite the... I'm not sure in the exact order anymore, because as I've run this campaign, things have kind of gotten a little disordered from the way it originally was. But you will have a stack of pre-generated characters. These will be useful for your players. You'll have a pack of handouts. This is very important. Put those to the side, but make sure they stay handy. You're going to want to reference those from time to time in the steps moving up. You will also have a couple of other useful sheets. And those will be a few general summary and guide sheets. These will help you keep the player characters' encounters a little bit better organized. They have the Hanata's NPC cheat sheet, which I'll get into in a second, and they also have the NPC's cheat sheets. This is a very thoughtful addition, and many adventures do have some sort of summary like that, so it's nice to have on hand. Having them separate from the main book is really useful because as you're moving these pieces around as you game master, you can keep them at hand at any given time. The other 2 things that you will find are the Gooey Way, our philosophy. This is a guide that explains how they made changes to the way that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition works for purposes of this particular work. And why that's important is there are some changes, and understanding why they made those changes might actually resonate with you, and you might decide, yeah, that's actually some really good game design. I kind of like that. There are some fundamental differences, and it's important to understand them, because if you change from that, you're going to need to change the adventure a little bit, and we'll explain that shortly. And then there's another one called Being Hanata's. This handout is something that is very useful for all your players to read through. Whether you just make this available to them to read through at your session 0, or you go to, I believe on gooeycube.com, you can download this for a resource for your players. But this is really nice in terms of helping fill in the gaps for your players. This serves as their background, explaining the way their characters live and kind of why they do. It also introduces them to several of the important NPCs in the group, which will allow them to hit the ground running as the game takes off. The game itself assumes that your players are at least passingly familiar with this information, so making this available to your players is really handy. There's also a nice little primer on here on the world of Xayathay that they've created, especially the glossary of terms and some of the expressions that are used, which will trickle in through the dialogue of the player characters to the non-player characters if you play your cards right. This helps to build the world and make it feel real to your players as you are going about spitting the game out. So why are those 2 so important? Well, the first one, as I said, the Gooey Way does explain a different philosophy. Now, if you've played 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons or even cracked the rulebook, you'll understand that leveling up your characters and gaining new powers is a major focus of the game. It's what the entire first half of the book is all about. Here's your character, you start out at first level, but here's all the impetus, all the new and cooler powers ramp up very quickly. And if you notice, that first level goes by really quickly. You only need 300 experience, and boom, you're second level. Maybe there might be training depending on what your game master likes, but still, it should come quite quickly. That is the opposite of the approach that Gooey Cube takes. Their idea is that some of the first experiences that your characters have as shining new first level characters, who are not, by the way, shining new. All those pre-generated characters have a background, have how they got trained, how they got put into this position, and they're a bit tougher than standard first level characters, which is again covered in the philosophy, as we will discuss. But it's those first steps that they take while they're still vulnerable, while they still need each other for survival against the ravages of the outside world. Those are special experiences, and a lot of players do seem to enjoy that low level quite a bit. Sure, some like to gather power and work on their build for their character and things like that. In Gooey Cube, it's important to appreciate the beginning times, where it all begins. And there's no real rush to get to the higher levels of power through the story. As a matter of fact, doesn't even happen according to the schedule of how Gooey Cube lays things out until the end of the second part. So they're going to be first level for a bit. That first level does not mean useless. It does not mean that things are futile. It means that the challenges are a little bit more mortal and that they are legitimately in danger a fair amount so that it feels real. There's drama. There's all of the suspense of having characters who are not young demigods breaking out into the world with amazing powers. Their powers are more mundane, and even the spellcasters don't have access to world-breaking magics at this point. Everything is kept in check until the story is ready for the characters to advance. This milestone approach goes even farther than the milestone approach recommended in the Dungeon Master's Guide of the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons core rulebook. But as you go through the story, you should make it clear to your players this function of the philosophy in that your characters are going to be vulnerable for a bit longer, but through that, you can be clever. You can use your mind and your wit to help your characters see things through, more so than just relying on having a higher end power or ability. It kind of brings things to the characters being the focus, more so than the power they'll eventually attend to. So, there's that. The other thing, too, is that your characters are heroes. They are not a random collection of misfits or whatever. There's a story and a purpose behind each one of the characters crafted as the pre-generated NPCs. And while you can use your own characters, certainly, those characters are designed to be woven into the story completely. They have everything in their background, their personalities and things that are already pre-generated, and all the player has to do is read them and understand the character, and you're ready to hit that adventure. Builds a couple of things into the game for you. Number one, all the characters have a reason to be there. Their family, they were raised by the Hanataz troop, and if they read that, being Hanataz, then they understand that their characters were orphans, they were given up because of things they were born with. Maybe they were born into the troop, but these are the people that love and care for them, and they should be willing to risk themselves and fight for them. In a world that often doesn't care about them, this family, this troop is all they've got, and they should be willing to do honest work for them, to risk themselves so that the troop thrives and survives. And when you see the faces of the characters through the portraits, bonding them to the troop, you have something good that needs to be preserved. So, alignment doesn't really matter. You all should have a motivation to try to stick together, to try to keep the troop intact, and to try to save your friends and your family. If a player has a hard time dealing with that, if they're too used to going their own way or something, this is going to be a challenge for them to rise up to, because, quite honestly, there's no wiggle room here. The characters have to work together. And it's not just because the story demands it. No, the world demands it. And if they constantly slink off alone and make it clear they don't want to be part of the troop, Number one, there's not a single one of the pre-generated characters that's okay with that. And if they do decide they're going to break off to follow their own pursuit and not be pushed by the story or what have you, they're just not part of the game. So, not that they necessarily have to play the pre-generated characters, but understanding why they're made the way they are, they're all sympathetic characters. Every single one of them has a spot that a player can attach significance to and want to see that struggle borne out through the game. That's why it's a matter of craft and artisanship to have these kind of characters all ready to go. And that's why those pre-generated characters give you so many different flavors and different varieties of character, so that everybody can try to find somebody they can resonate with. Now, as a game master, you don't have to have all of those things memorized. As a matter of fact, unless you are running a group of 24 players, a number of those characters are not going to be picked for this adventure, which means you technically don't really have to worry about them. I would honestly wait before delving into the characters to see what everybody has picked. And once they do, there will be some preparation involved to that. But for now, just appreciate what those pre-generated characters mean. They are an asset to you because if the characters are being played right, you shouldn't have to worry about the lone wolf who stays away from the whole group. Not a single one of them would do that. You don't have to worry about anybody who's genuinely evil and would work against the interests of the party. If somebody does that, they are not playing in character. And they are not really being a part of this game. You know the kind of player they're being then and can take steps or, just realize that some people are just going to try to ruin your game for you if that's the case. But no, all of the characters are sympathetic. They all have a motivation and a reason to work within the group, and a role that they can eventually cling to as the group faces challenges as a whole. So the pre-generated characters there are there to make your life easier, O Game Master, because, again, the characters make a certain amount of sense to be there. And the characters are, of course, going to be given their own spin by the players, but you shouldn't have to worry about, again, somebody going rogue and doing horrible things. And you shouldn't have to worry terribly about characters who are just generally bad actors. There's no warlocks, for instance, and even the rogues in the group are generally ones that want to see the group do well. And there's a couple of interesting, unique classes that are unique to Gooey Cube. Those add another flavor to the game, but realistically don't break it. They fall right in line with the other core classes, so the Agents of Jinx and the Spell Dancer just add flavor to the world. Although, if you do have somebody who picks one of those in a further step, which we will get into, you'll want to know the differences. So we'll cover that later too. So that's everything that's in the box. Now, the importance of everything. This is the overall of this particular video. First of all, the storybook. Why is this important? As a game master, you should read through this. The whole thing. Beginning to end. The first part, if you're an experienced game master, you can browse. It explains how to run games. Explains why this is different because of the Gooey Cube philosophy. Which if you've read the little blurb on the Gooey Way, you already understand a lot of these things. So you might be okay with just skimming through the why we did this, how things are the way they are, but it's a good read. And it does kind of give you some nice hints on why Gooey Cube is different from other game companies and other adventures that you might eventually come across. There's an adventure overview. And there's a nice little bit of fiction that the players will never themselves see. This was written just for you. It's called the Shrouded Flame. But, it gives you a sense of foreshadowing about what's coming up in the future. Just a little bit of fiction, but kind of nice. The adventure overview is relatively short, but it does cover some of the poignant details that you're going to need to know. And this is relatively spoiler-free in this particular video, but as we go on, I'm going to uncover those areas for you. And if you're a player, you should not look into those videos, as you will have some really nice points of this adventure ruined for you if you know they're coming. GM notes abound, so there are tips and tricks on how to run the various points of the game. The dungeons aren't really all that difficult to run as far as dungeons go, and yeah, there's a dungeon in this game. But when it comes to running an open, more of a sandbox scenario where the area is open, the players can go to encounters as they choose to, that does sometimes rattle some game masters. So there's some advice in here on how to run that kind of thing. And of course, there's several sections in here that talk about being Hanatas and the experience the characters are going to have. If you want to read this entire thing out to your players to get them set up, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and can really kind of get them on the right road. What I did was I actually emailed the opening to the players to let them read about it in advance. And then when they got here, because I know they'd forgotten half of it, I read it again to drive the point home, which worked out pretty well. They really were into it by that point. Then if you go through this, the storybook, all the way through, you will get the meat of the adventure. Now, one of the things about this is that it does tend to jump around a bit. You have to understand that. The entire middle section of it is full of different encounters that players can go to that don't necessarily have to be done in any particular order. They're just different things that the characters can encounter that will offer foreshadowing for what's coming up, not just at the end of this adventure, but also further chapters of this story. And 2, it allows characters to have some say over the kind of adventure they're going to have. If they hover around certain areas, it's going to define a certain kind of game experience their characters are going to have. You could use brute force and make them go through every single one of those encounters if you wish, but that's not necessarily required, and I don't honestly recommend that necessarily. You can make it all fit within a given day if you wish to, but I just prefer to let the players have at it as they wish. If they're in a hurry and they want to see everything, they can move at a quicker pace. But if they're the kind who just enjoy the role play and enjoy taking time out to live as their characters do, so be it. Much of these encounters don't have to have completion to them in order to make the story continue forward. So, there's a lot in here. Also, the modular approach of this means that you can rip whole sections out of this and put those into other adventures. You can put them into your own adventures if you want. Some of the encounters will actually work rather well for doing just that. So, that's that core book. Then the Game Master's Guide. This has a lot of other things, but I think some of these elements actually fit in really well with the story as well. Of course, all of the hard statistics are in here, as well as some other details about things like encounters that don't necessarily have to be a set encounter that when the characters get to this area, this happens. Sometimes as a game master, you kind of have to feel out the adventure, and as a result, they don't really use random monster encounters or wandering monster encounters. Instead, they have not-so-random encounters, NSREs, which are, if the Game Master thinks that the campaign needs to have an encounter, needs to have a different kind of an engagement, or they want to set up something down the road, they can throw in an encounter as the party goes from place to place, and they can have something that may not be essential to the adventure, but it can flavor the experience for the players, and it gives the Game Master a lot of controls over the kind of experience the players will have. If done right, it can make the world feel alive and vibrant and breathing, which is why reading through these books is so important. This isn't the kind of thing that you want to stumble onto as you're going along and then later on go, oh wow, I wish I could have used that encounter back. No, you should read the stuff in advance before you get to the game, maybe even make a few notes as to what kind of encounters you have, what you want to have follow up with another encounter, and what you just don't want to use. There are some things in here that I didn't use in my run-through, and I was fine with that because it didn't really fit the temperament and flavor of the characters. They wanted to go through the things that made more sense to the overall story. So, with a sampling of those not-so-random encounters, then you go to the battle stats tables. Now, we'll break those down for you in a little while, but what's important about that is that those don't necessarily have to be read through and memorized. You should note them, of course, as any game master should look at encounters and see where the different challenges will be. And we'll talk about setting up these different encounters in a little bit. Well, actually, we'll talk about it in another video. But still, there's some interesting features in there that we're going to go over. And battle stats are nice to have in a separate book so that you can compare the storyline where it's going on and follow along the challenges as you flip through that other book open at the same time. And there's a lot of those battle stats, by the way. Why is there so much over something that is very, very narrative? It's because those stat blocks are more customizable than you usually find, and they're there so that you have, again, an even greater amount of control and flexibility in the way encounters are run and how they're handled. A party that is beat up after other encounters went poorly, you can soften up encounters so they don't feel overmatched and overwhelmed. Parties stomping through everything you've thrown at them, you can make challenging encounters that will meet your party where they're at. And that is pretty darn useful. And it's all not done on the fly. It's all done here, calculated out to give you the greatest amount of aid. So if you take advantage of that, the players are going to think you're amazing, when really you've just been following different helps that have been put in as you go. There's a rumors and lore table. That's certainly something that you may have seen in other games and can be very useful for adding more flair to your world and foreshadowing, especially foreshadowing. That becomes very, very useful in such a story-driven game, admittedly. If you ignore that part and leave it out, you're not doing the party a whole lot of justice, and there's so much. There's so many different rumors that you can tangle the party up in if they just reach for them. And sometimes just brushing against the right person can give them a useful bit of information and lore, some of which won't be felt until the next chapter altogether. So, the town of Nevermore itself is very thinly defined. That is the nearby town. So the party should not really be going there for this storyline. There are a couple of major, and again, I can't really touch on them without spoilers, so there are a couple of major twists that you have to make decisions on before the game actually starts, Game Masters. And we'll discuss those in a future video. But those elements are in the Game Master's Guide, and you should know about them if you're going to follow the storyline through, because they'll add some extra elements to the game. Certainly a different weirdness factor, which is useful. The special items and non-magical items in the book have their own little guide section, which is really nice. It's all summed up there so that you can reference things as the players find different items. You have it all there at your fingertips. And then just some things about customizing the game for you, how you can take this game and make it your own. So as you can see, both of those books, very, very useful. They both have a lot of information, and they both should be absorbed to at least a fair degree, so that you can know what's coming up in the story. You know how to handle different encounters and different situations as they come up in the Darkest Dream. So, that's the significance of those. Those are the meat and potatoes of the game. If you don't understand that, if you haven't read through that, this game will be a shambles of what it could be. It would be like a cook having some vague idea and a bunch of ingredients in front of them and just throwing it all in a pot and hoping it works out. It might be okay, but not as good as if you had followed the recipe and, gone through step by step and layered the different flavors, and the end is a masterpiece as opposed to, well, I guess you could call it stew. So, now, a couple other things. First of all, the cheat sheets are good notes to keep on hand. You could even make notes on them if you prefer. Depends on how often you want to run this adventure or who you want to hand them off to. If you have a separate piece of paper along with this so that you can keep any lasting notes, probably a good idea, especially regarding the relationship of the players as they change with the various NPCs. For instance, if they meet a character named, say, Smedley, who is smitten with the group, then you have somebody that the group can consistently keep running into who will always react a certain way to them, and consistency makes the world seem more believable. If, for instance, the leader of the Blue Veil troop, his name is Borag, he's a fun fellow. If he's angry because one of the players did something foolish or reckless, the next time they see Borag, he's probably going to make a cutting comment about what's irritating him because he's the boss. He can do that. He's dad. So he very likely will respond and reflect back to those experiences. So something like this is great, and having notes on how the web of influences around the players changes and evolves through the story can be really good too, and we will talk about that in a future time. But that is a nice part of the game. Now, the characters we're going to be talking about with the next video in the series, and the advantages of having these pre-generated characters ready to go. But I will just say that they're optional. You don't need to use them, despite the fact they have really nice art, really nicely thought through characters with their own secrets and background history and things. But if you don't want to use them, you don't really have to. I will say, though, these characters are a little plus sized. They have more hit points and generally more resources than your common character, because they're going to be first level for a while, and that's baked into the philosophy of Gooey Cube and this entire campaign. So note that if you're going to go off the script and use your own characters. Just saying. I would say add 2 extra hit points to every non-fighting character, 3 to every support character, and 4 to the frontline fighting characters, and you'll probably be doing okay. As far as the other benefits they have from being Hanatas or blood touches from Zyathe, blood touches are further explained in the Weirded World. The Encyclopedia Zyathica, Volume 1, explains blood touches, which give characters a reason to be Hanatas. If you don't incorporate that, and you don't want to deal with blood touches, then they can just be characters. They don't have to have that. It's just kind of one of those neat things of the world and baked into the situation. So we will discuss the player characters. Never worry about that. That will definitely be the next video. As far as the handouts go, Game Master's hearts skip a beat a little bit when you see a nice map. And this one comes with maps of all of the encounter scenarios. The one you'll use the most, the Carnival map, that shows an overhead view of what the Carnival looks like with all the different places that they can have encounters. There's one with the Game Master's selection, so that has all the names for everything and their location numbers, and the players doesn't have that, so they can go, I want to go here, that looks interesting, and you know what that all means and everything. Now, bear in mind, the characters know what the layout is. They've seen several Carnivals. Some of them have seen perhaps hundreds of showings of the Carnival to various towns and cities. But for the players encountering this for the first time, it's kind of cool to look, okay, I want to see what this is. And this is the Tent of Jests. And you get to meet these characters and so on and so forth. Now, why is this especially useful, though? The maps are great. The players' maps, if you want, I kind of hesitate a little bit at using players' maps for dungeons and areas they can't see. The Carnival you can see just by walking around all the sites. But the dungeons, you can use a Fog of War trick by putting something like, for instance, Post-it notes and peeling them off as players uncover new corridors and chambers. It's fine. There's tips on doing that in the storybook. But the one thing to note is that this isn't to scale, so 1 inch is not going to equal 5 feet, so you can't put your miniatures on these maps. These are merely to keep the players occupied on where they've been. If you go old school, you can have them map out the areas themselves. That can work pretty well. If you have 3D dungeoning events and you really want to, guss it up, you can by all means do that. That can be awfully fun. But even if you have just a battle map and you sketch things out as they encounter them, that works too. And then they can put their miniatures on that and roll them around. Just to warn you, some of the encounters will be unique to Zyathe, but there's plenty of proxies that you can use. So we'll discuss that as we go to those elements as well. But what really is the meat and potatoes of the Gooey Cube experience, and I firmly believe this, these handouts that are not maps. All the location the players will be able to go to with their characters have a fine art picture showing the different people, showing the different locations, showing the monsters and the challenges and the puzzles. This is really what sets this apart from other adventures. These full color illustrations all serve to put your characters in the experience and make them be their characters for a little while, because they all see the same thing. They all have their hearts skip a beat for the most dramatic of images and scenes. So yeah, this is really what I think really completely sets the Gooey Cube experience apart. Having these is a wonderful thing. So never lose those, never devalue those handouts. They will make your game sing when used accurately. Likewise, the other art assets are these portraits, like my friend Borag here. And all of the various characters. They look odd. They look handsome. They look beautiful. They look, they give you a feeling that words alone have a hard time expressing in how their characters might react to some of the various people around them. They're all wonderful portraits. Some of them are maybe not necessarily the most flattering portraits, but they do evoke something within the players when they see them. And as a game master, you having these cues like, this is Borag. Borag has his own voice. Borag. I try to capture Goliath from the Gargoyles when I think of Borag. He's noble, self-sacrificing, but he doesn't take any kind of nonsense from anyone who's going to threaten his troop. And that's one of the big benefits. When the players can see who it is they're talking to instead of looking across the table and seeing the game master, it helps put them in the position that their characters would be in. It helps them to take things a little bit more seriously, or know when something's a little bit more lighthearted. And that all helps in the immersion tremendously. Another indescribably useful part of a Gooey Cube story. And all of their boxed adventures have this in abundance. Then finally, the rewards. Treasure. Obviously an important reason characters go and get experience, sure, but also the treasure is something that should not be discounted. And in Dungeons & Dragons, treasure is important. Now, an interesting thing is that there's a lot of special items that aren't necessarily magical, but are still neat to have. Even the magical items aren't overwhelmingly powerful. This is for first level characters. So these aren't amazing, blow the door down magical items, but they can be incredibly useful to low-level characters who have limited resources to draw from. They'll be grateful enough for those items, and if you give them a card that explains what the items are so they can be reminded of their powers, and they can actually have a handful of neat items they've collected, that means so much more than just ticking off a box on their character sheet or filling in a note on their combat chart. So this is a really nice thing, and being able to toss somebody a card and it's like, oh, my character now has this Seric Iron Wakizashi. Yeah, that's much cooler than just saying, okay, your character finds this special Wakizashi that gives them a bonus to strike in combat. The Gooey rewards, something that you're not going to find in other adventures typically. Again, you're keeping the characters relatively low level. You do need an equalizer to keep things exciting and interesting. The Gooey rewards are handed out for excellent play and sometimes just as a general celebration of hitting a milestone with your group. Not one that gets you up a level, but sometimes one that can give out rewards, such as these Gooey rewards. They're all one-shot rewards. They can be used and redeemed at a variety of times, often to give yourself advantage on a particular roll. That means you roll twice and take the better roll. Maybe to give you some quick healing when you desperately need it, or some temporary hit points before a particularly fearsome opponent that you're going to have to confront. There's even one that gives you a permanent hit point added to your total, so these are not insignificant and can really turn the tide in a tough situation. They are designed, however, to not be something that's just traded around and discounted at a higher experience level. players find reasons to use these because they constantly find themselves in danger, and they do get used. So, as a game master, I generally tend to hand them out fairly liberally, but there are a variety of places within the adventure that say, hey, if the party got through this, consider letting them roll to see who gets a Gooey reward, or I like to give them out as personal attaboy awards or attagirl for good roleplay, for making the party really enjoy the game more. We'll talk about all of these elements later, but this is just your introduction on what needs to be done and the importance of the different parts that are in the book so that you can run the Darkest Dream and make it the best game you've ever run for your players. And that's what's in the box. That's what you need, and again, what you should be concentrating on with your first run. Read the main books, understand the story, at the very least, where the story flows to, how the characters get to the dungeon, certainly important, how the different events can interconnect, and we'll discuss and break things down later as we go. This is the last of these videos for the Darkest Dream that players could eavesdrop in and not have anything spoiled. Going forward, we're going to get a lot more specific, which means we're going to talk about the events within the game itself. So, hopefully, you know what you're talking about, you've done some reading, you're ready to run this awesome adventure, and you'll come back and see us when the next video is available. So, I'm Rob the Dungeon Tutor. Thanks for joining me. This has been the first master class. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully your Darkest Dream is just that little bit brighter because you knew what you were talking about and you were prepared. Until that next time, farewell.